Hello, my name is Samuel, and in today's episode of Going to the Source, I'm going to be looking at one of the early English encounters with other indigenous tribes in Virginia, and with it, a situation that shows an interesting reaction to the language barrier between two peoples. Today we are going to be pulling from two sources again. We are once again drawing from Smith's General Histories, but we're also drawing from a letter that survived that also tells this story. However, before we get into the passages, it is important to set up the context. So, the story focuses around an expedition led by Captain Christopher Newport up the James River and to the Fall Line and into the Piedmont region of Virginia that takes place in November of 1608. The goal of the expedition was to make contact with the Monacan and Mahanahoic nations who resided beyond the Fall Line through the Blue Ridge Mountains, who are described as living in towns that were palisaded with domed homes and who also traded with the Powhatan and the Iroquois. But in May of 1607, Powhatan, the Manitowoc, sent his son Parahunt, a werowance, to attempt to persuade the English not to venture past the falls and into Monacan territory. Now, at this time, Powhatan was in conflict with the Monacan, and so it's possible that he wanted to keep the English and their potential supply of weaponry and soldiers away from the Monacan, but against the wishes of Powhatan, it's this expedition that the English partake in, and we'll go into our first source with John Smith's General Histories. He opens writing about the Mary Margaret, one of the ships of the 1608 resupply, which actually carried Mistress Forrest and Anne Burrs, the first two English women of the colony, and alongside the first German and Polish settlers, and Peter Wynne, an English captain who is a player in the story, but later on. He writes, the ship having disburdened herself of 70 persons with the first gentlewoman and woman servant that arrived in our colony, Captain Newport with 120 chosen men, led by Captain Waldo, Lieutenant Pierce, Captain Wynne, Mr. West, and Mr. Scrivener, set forward for the discovery of Monacan, leaving the President at the fort with about 80 or 90, such as they were, to relay the ship. Arriving at the falls, we marched by land some 40 miles in 2 days and a half, and so returned down the same path we went. 2 towns we discovered of the Monacans, called Messinicac and Mohemenco. The people neither used us well nor ill. Yet, for our security, we took one of their petty kings and let him bound to conduct us the way. With that, we know the English were pretty serious about this expedition, and though there was difficulty communicating, we're sure, we know the Monacan at least were tolerating of the English and their presence, but also seemed as if the Monacan didn't care. Now, they were most likely cautious because John Smith writes later on in reference to the Monacan, trade they would not, and find their corn we could not, for they had hid it in the woods. Now, whether or not they had actually hidden their corn, we don't know. But it's potentially good foresight by the Monacan to at least not make their food stores obvious to the English, considering they were probably actively looking for it. But also, with English forcefully taking one of the chiefs of these towns for security, again, probably good foresight by the Monacan to be a bit cautious. But now we enter the second source, and the part of the story that has to deal with the language barrier. So, the Monacans spoke a regional dialect of Siouan called Tutelo or Tutelo-Saponi, which is found east of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. But our second source, a letter from Captain Wynne to Sir John Egerton in England, we read, the people of the Monacan speak a language far differing from the subjects of the Powhatan, their pronunciation being very much like Welsh, so that our gentlemen in our company desired me to be their interpreter. Now, what I find makes this more interesting and to me quite funny is the chances of two languages being completely isolated from each other happening to form similar enough to communicate between them with no prior meetings are very slim. So, we have a newly arrived officer, Captain Wynne, thrust into a situation where he had to be translator for a language which the English thought sounded like Welsh, but was in no way Welsh. So, the success of Captain Wynne's interpretation and the likely subsequent confusion between parties probably left much to be desired in terms of communication. But, with all that said, the English after this returned to Jamestown fairly disgruntled. As John Smith writes, "We arrived at Jamestown half sick, all complaining and tired with toil, famine, and discontent." So safe to say this wasn't the most successful expedition taken on by the officers and men of the Virginia Company. But if you found humor in this interesting story with the communication issues that happen early on, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe.